Nancy Drew Mystery Stories number 21, The Secret in the Old Attic, by Carolyn Keene. Copyright 1970, Simon & Schuster. Chapter 1, A Challenge. It seems strange to hunt for a clue among these, Nancy, but that's exactly what I've been asked to do. Carson Drew was gazing at a pack of letters tied with blue ribbon, which he had taken from his pocket. He laid them on the dining room table. He was the outstanding attorney of River Heights and had won many difficult cases by his brilliant, clear thinking. "What's the clue about?" Nancy asked. "Some lost music." "Music? What kind?" "Popular songs, I believe, which haven't been published yet," Mr. Drew replied. "This task isn't exactly to my liking. I understand these are love letters and—" Nancy smiled as he rather clumsily tried to loosen the knot in the ribbon that bound the letters. She offered to do it for him, and he looked relieved. "Please tell me more about the case," she begged. "Maybe I can help you with it." "I believe you can," her father replied, his eyes twinkling. "I'd say this is more your kind of mystery than mine, Nancy." He looked affectionately at the slim, blue-eyed girl. Mr. Drew was proud of his 18-year-old daughter, who had gained a reputation of her own by solving many mysteries. She and her father had been very close since the death of Mrs. Drew when Nancy was only 3, and had come to depend on each other for advice and assistance. "What are you supposed to look for in these letters?" Nancy asked. "I don't know," her father replied. "The instructions were vague. This afternoon, while I was away from my office, an elderly man named Philip March left the letters with my secretary. He asked that I look through them for a clue as to where certain original songs that have disappeared might have gone." "Who composed them?" Nancy asked. "I don't know." Nancy had untied the ribbon and now handed the letters to her father. He pulled one from its envelope and read it hastily. "I don't find any clue here," the lawyer said a few moments later. "Read this, Nancy, and see what you make of it." The letter had been written 4 years ago by a young lieutenant named Phipp to his wife Connie. "I don't see any clue either," Nancy said. "Do you suppose Phipp is a nickname for Philip, and he's Mr. March's son?" "Probably," Mr. Drew agreed, handing the other letters to his daughter. "I'm mighty embarrassed going through these. Love letters never were meant to be read by the outside world." Nancy respected her father's opinion, yet she felt that if Mr. March was a close relative of the writer, he would not have shown the letters to anyone without a very good reason. "Have you ever met Mr. March?" she asked. "I think not, but he may be a member of a family that lived on an estate up the river a few miles. Well, we'll soon know about the letters. Mr. March is coming here this evening." Nancy was eager to meet him. While waiting, she read the letters, pausing at several lovely verses in them. Nowhere, however, could she find any clue to lost or hidden music. "Do you suppose these verses are the words of the songs?" she mused. "Maybe they're—" Just then the bell rang, and Nancy hurried to the door. The caller was a gray-haired gentleman of military bearing. His clothes were somewhat worn, but his shoes were polished and his suit neatly pressed. He bowed politely to Nancy and introduced himself as Philip March. "Oh, yes, my father is expecting you. Please come in." Nancy led the man into the living room where Carson Drew was waiting. When she started to leave, Mr. March invited her to stay and hear his story. He sank wearily into a chair. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Drew, for asking such a strange favor," he began in a tired voice. "A feeling of desperation came over me this afternoon. On the spur of the moment, I decided to come to your office. You and your daughter have helped so many people. I thought you might advise me." The elderly man was very pale and ill at ease. To give him time to compose himself, Nancy offered to serve coffee. This seemed to refresh him somewhat, and Mr. Drew then inquired if the writer of the letters was someone close to him. "Yes, he was my son. My only son," the caller said sadly. "In fact, he was my only child, and a soldier as I once was. But he lost his life 4 years ago on a routine training mission." "I'm sorry to hear that," Mr. Drew said sympathetically, and Nancy added a word of condolence. "Phip, that's what my Philip called himself when he was a little boy, and the name stuck," Mr. March went on. "Phip was married to a lovely girl, but she passed away soon after he did. Then my wife died. Now all I have is little Susan. Her mother entrusted her to my care." "She is your grandchild?" Nancy asked. "Yes. Susan is 6 years old, and I want to keep her with me, but—" The elderly man closed his eyes, as if to shut out an unhappy thought. "To bring her up properly, I should have a housekeeper. But I can't afford one unless Phip's music can be found and sold. Besides, I may lose our home. My income is so small." "Please tell us more about the music," Nancy begged, touched by the man's story. "Perhaps I should start by briefing you on my family. The Marches have been proud, well-to-do people, several generations of us in River Heights. I'm not going to be the one to ask for charity for my granddaughter. Phip wouldn't want me to." As Mr. March paused to take another sip of coffee, Carson Drew inquired how the lost music could bring him any money. "The songs were never published," the caller replied, "and they were very fine." He turned to Nancy. "The kind of up-to-date music you young people like, but much better than a lot of it I hear." Nancy was interested at once. "My son could not bring himself to take the songs to a publisher, for he was never quite satisfied with his work," Mr. March explained. Then, just before he entered the service, Phip put the music away in some secret place. "If it can only be found and sold, little Susan will be amply provided for." "Mr. March, what made you think there was a clue to the songs in these letters?" Nancy asked. "Connie, Susan's mother, wrote to Phip, suggesting that he tell us where the music was. My boy was full of fun, and replied that he'd give her a hint and she could look for it. Then, after a few more letters—" At this point, Mr. March bowed his head. No others came. Several moments of silence followed. Finally, Mr. Drew spoke. "My daughter and I could not find a clue, but perhaps we can if we study the letters more thoroughly." Thank you, Mr. March murmured. "I'll remember your kindness always. I'd never ask your help for myself, only for Susan. A friend has been caring for her lately, but she's moving away and is bringing Susan back to me the first of the week. I must do something very soon. Susan has no other relatives to take care of her. If I am not financially able to do it, I will have to ask for charity. This would have broken her parents' hearts. Nancy and her father accompanied their caller to the door, promising to do what they could. As he stepped outside, a rock came whizzing through the air toward him. It struck Mr. March on the head, and he slumped to the flagstone walk. "Oh!" Nancy cried. She rushed outside and bent over the inert form. Mr. Drew glanced in the direction from which the missile had been hurled. He spotted a man darting from a cluster of bushes that lined one side of the semicircular driveway. At this distance, the lawyer knew he could not overtake the fugitive. Together, Nancy and her father carried the stricken figure inside and laid him on the living room couch. By this time, Hannah Gruen, the Drews' motherly housekeeper who had helped rear Nancy, hurried in. "I think," she said worriedly, "that we should call Dr. Ivers." The others agreed, and she went to phone him and also the police to give a full report. By the time the physician arrived, Mr. March had regained consciousness. After an examination, he said the man need not go to the hospital. However, he should not try to travel alone or drive a car. Dr. Ivers turned to the others. "Mr. March is suffering more from malnutrition than from the lump on his head. What he needs is rest and good food for a few days." "I have no car," the visitor said. "Can't afford it." At once, Nancy whispered to her father, "Why don't we keep him here?" The lawyer nodded and conveyed the invitation to Mr. March. At first he hesitated, then accepted weakly. Mr. Drew and the doctor carried him upstairs to the guest room. "I'll fix a bowl of broth," said Mrs. Gruen, heading for the kitchen. "Make some toast, Nancy," she directed. When the food tray, which included a broiled hamburger and rice pudding, was ready, Nancy carried it upstairs. Mr. March seemed to enjoy the food, then fell asleep, mumbling that he would leave in the morning. But when morning came, Nancy persuaded him to stay by telling him she needed more information about the missing music. "You rest now, and later we'll go over the letters together," she told him. During the day, Nancy brought up trays of food to Mr. March and encouraged him to talk about himself. She found him to be a delightful, cultured person. The past few years he had not been strong and therefore had been unable to work very much. "I want you to see my house sometime," he said late that afternoon. "Of course, it doesn't look like it used to. I don't make a very good housekeeper, and I haven't been able to afford one, or a gardener either, for a long time." "How old is the house?" Nancy asked. "Over 200 years. At least part of it is." "How intriguing!" she exclaimed. "When you're well enough to go home, I'll drive you there, and then you can show the place to me." In the midst of this conversation, the doorbell rang. Nancy excused herself, turned on the bedside radio, then hurried downstairs. "Hi, George and Bess," said Nancy, as she opened the front door wide. She grinned at George. "My goodness, you've had more hair cut off." George Fane was an attractive, slender brunette. She tossed her head. "Anyway, Bert Eddleton had better like it." "Nancy," said her companion, "we came to find out if you plan to get a new dress for the Emerson dance." Bess Marvin, George's pretty, slightly plump cousin, was going to it with Dave Evans. "I haven't given it much thought," Nancy replied. I've started helping Dad on a new case, and when you're working on a mystery, you have a one-track mind," George finished with a grin. "Can you tell us anything about the case?" Bess asked. Nancy briefed George and Bess about Phip March's music. The girls were interested and offered their assistance if Nancy should need it. "I'll keep in touch," Nancy promised. "And don't forget the dance," George teased, as the cousins said goodbye. Nancy went back to Mr. March's room. Beautiful music was coming from the radio. It was a trumpet solo of a haunting tune with orchestral accompaniment. Suddenly, Mr. March cried out excitedly, "That melody! It was my son's! He never had it published! The song has been stolen! You must find the thief!" End of Chapter 1.